All right. So what I'm going to do, I've told everybody that we're obviously talking about story slicing, and I'm going to make sure that we're recording because we are sharing the recording. Okay. So everything is being recorded at the moment, which is great. If anyone here has questions as we go forward, at this point, let's switch all the Q&A to the Q&A button. It makes it a little easier for me to help moderate those and help sprinkle them in near the end when Kim is going to be happy to take some questions. We'll be sharing the recording with everybody at the end. And if for some reason we don't get to your question in the Q&A, please pose it anyway, because one of the things we're planning on doing is in the follow-up, we'll be answering some of those questions that we didn't get to answer during the webinar. And some of them are really going to be worthy, I think, of either follow-up lean coffee sessions or follow-up webinars. So posing a question is not wasted time. I think it could turn into something interesting in the future for all of us. So with that, I just want to introduce Kim Poremski. Kim is one of our principal consultants here at Applied Frameworks. Kim is actually, she's an extremely well-rounded consultant with a really interesting background before joining the team as a consultant. But one of the things that I love about working with Kim is she's got some really strong product management muscle and thinking about how to translate a product vision into a backlog that a team can actually work with is one of her superpowers, along with other things. So in this particular case, that's the superpower we'll be leveraging. And with that, Kim, let me turn it over to you. You can go ahead and share your slide deck with folks. And again, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A. And so if you have anything that you want to see if I can either interject or things that we can talk about near the end of the webinar, I'll be helping with that.
Okay, let's go ahead and give this a go and see if we can at least get the sharing to work.
Looks great. I can see it.
Okay, I seem to be, let me just do a quick little maneuvering here though, because it looks like my, now you get to see my face. The display is doing some interesting things here for me. So that's not what I want to share. Hang on one second. Let me try this one more time. It's not wanting to.
Yeah, the joys of many monitors. When you get them set up right, they're perfect, but.
Well, it's not giving me the speaker view. Any tips for Google Slides? Usually it just shows up. So
well, it's you have to, instead of the whole display, you have to say presenter view. So when you want to share, click the presenter view under share, and you should get your speaker notes that way.
Oh, okay. That's what I was missing. Okay, excellent. So let me try this one more time. I appreciate all the patience. I'm having a day for sure. Let's see. This is so funny too, because, you know, you would think I've never done this before, but all the fun of being online and presenting. So let me make one more adjustment here, and then we will be on our way. And the good thing is we can also edit this recording, so you don't have to see all this extra stuff here.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, Josh just posed a question in there. Yeah, so let's just, I'm sorry about the chat being disabled for you. We've got a bunch of people on this webinar, so we're going to keep everyone muted for the moment, but Q&A is totally working for me. So if you have questions or comments, use the Q&A, and they're all queuing up for me and I can see them all.
Oh, that's terrific. Excellent. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, well, now I can finally take a deep breath and let's actually have a little bit of fun here for roughly the next hour. So I did want to say,
Kim, by the way, are you sharing a screen? Because we don't see it yet.
Let me do that one more time. Yeah, but I think it unshared the last time. So let me try that one more time. And
all right, we see it now. Looks great.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, we are finally in business. Well, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for your patience while we worked out some of these technical glitches. And thank you to Laura for the great introduction, and many thanks to all of you on this webinar today for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with me talking about vertical story slicing. This is actually a presentation that I have given on numerous occasions, and yet it never seems to get old. And the reason for that I believe, is because it is a bit of an art form. It's not an exact science. And so folks struggle with that quite a bit. And so I would love to be able to share some tips and tricks with you today, share some examples, and see what you can do to put this into practice with your teams. So before I get into talking about vertical story slicing, I first want to level set on what is a user story. Because when we talk about Scrum, Scrum simply has product backlog items. User stories are actually a construct from extreme programming, and a lot of Scrum teams do use user stories as a way to document their product backlog items. The whole idea is user story. In other words, it is written from the perspective of a customer or an end user. And that's one of the challenges that I often see. And that's where vertical story slicing can help, because I do see a lot of user stories, and I'm using those air quotes, that are not actually user stories after all. We talk about user stories in the concept of the 3 C's: card, conversation, and confirmation. The idea around the card is that you want to create a user story that is small enough that you could articulate what it is that you want on a single index card. And this single index card is a promise to have a conversation with the team. So there's enough information on that card to convey what it is, what outcomes we're trying to achieve, and why this is important to the customer. But it's not this comprehensive documentation that teams are sometimes accustomed to. If you think about this concept in the terms of a photograph, if I have vacation photos and I print them out, which nobody seems to do anymore, but if I did have them all printed out, I'm not going to have lots of detail written on the back of that photograph, but I can look at that photograph and all of these details are going to come back to me. You know, oh, this is the restaurant where we ate, and this is who was here, and oh, I had that really interesting dish. So with just looking at that one photograph, you have all of those details because it was that tickler. So this is very similar concept in that way. So you want to think about a user story as like a tickler for the conversation that the team has. The third C is confirmation. We refer to this as acceptance criteria. So how will we know that the outcome that we are asking for in this user story, how will we know that we've actually delivered it? What are the things that we want to validate? So those are the 3 C's that we talk about with a user story. So when you're talking about a good user story, you want to think about, who is this actually intended for? Who is receiving that value? One of the things that I often see is, as a user, I would like this feature or functionality. Well, if that's too generic, then it's going to make it harder for us to pinpoint and be more focused in what it is we're trying to deliver. So you want your user story to focus in on a particular customer segment or persona. So that's really going to help you to break down those user stories by thinking about, who is this actually for? If you have too wide of a group, too wide of a customer segment, your story is going to tend to be a lot bigger. The feature, that's what we talked about on that index card. So what is it that I want? We're talking about the outcomes. We're not talking about the very specific outputs. We talk about why. What is the value? You're going to hear me say that word a lot: value, value, value. That acceptance criteria, which a lot of teams will use a format called Gherkin, given, when, then. So given that I'm already logged into the system, when I go to check out, I would like, then my address should be pre-populated. And while this isn't a required format, if teams write it in this way, it often makes it a lot easier to write automated acceptance tests and so forth. It's also okay to have supporting documentation related to a user story. We just want to get away from that massive documentation. But if there are flow charts or wireframes or diagrams or what have you that can also help to convey what that outcome is that we are looking for, then certainly that is perfectly acceptable. There's a lot of different formats people use to write user stories. There's no right or wrong per se. Some folks like to just put their title and then use a who, what, why format. Other folks might be familiar with as a user, and I use that in brackets because we want to be more descriptive, I want some sort of value by delivering such and such feature. Or flip it, as a user, I would like this feature because it will deliver this value. So there's a lot of different formats that you can use. So that's just a quick overview of what we mean by user stories in the first place. So in all of my years of coaching agile teams, these are some of the things that I have encountered along the way. I have teams that struggle because the stories are simply too big and they just can't possibly fit them into a sprint. They know they want to, they know they don't want carryover, but they just can't figure out how to do so. I have actually had teams change their sprint cadence. They might be operating on a 2-week sprint and they say, oh, we couldn't quite get this story done, so we're going to just extend the sprint a little bit. We're going to maybe make it 3 weeks. To me, that's like saying, I want to get this accomplished in the month of July. Oh, I didn't quite hit the mark, so I'm going to extend the month of July by a few extra days. It's like, no, it's going to be August no matter what. So we don't want to change the sprint cadence per se, but how do we make sure that we can get things done within the confines of that sprint? A lot of teams will create stories and they're not independent enough. So consequently, they can't get this story done because this story over here is needed for something else. And so consequently, they have this dependency, and that creates challenges for them as well because they end up having multiple things that are not done. Sometimes folks, when they write the stories, they can't really tell what the difference is. So that becomes a challenge also. I have other teams that do carryover work to the next sprint. So at least they're not changing the sprint cadence, but you still don't want to have all of that carryover. And sometimes when you have stories that are too big because you know you need this chunk of functionality, you're looking at the work and you're saying, I don't know how to prioritize this. It's all equally important. So how do I do this? If we can break things down smaller, it makes it a little bit easier to figure out, oh, this is definitely more important than this other thing. And then another pattern that I see is where stories are written in a very technical voice. And so consequently, it's an indication that it might not actually be a user story. It might actually be a task. When things are written in a very technical voice, you probably are losing the customer value. What does the customer care about? So again, we're going to talk about ways that we can manage all of these challenges that I've encountered in the past. So one thing that's important to keep in mind for good user stories is the INVEST criteria. This is an acronym that was created by a gentleman named Bill Wake. And I read a blog long time ago about how the process that he went through to find the right word, because he had all of these characteristics of what he believed was a good user story and how can I create an acronym around that. So he ultimately came up with INVEST. Now I tend to hone right in again on that V, valuable. First and foremost, a user story needs to be valuable. It has to be something that the customer cares about, that the customer would say, yes, this is what I want. I can experiment with this. I can give feedback on this. Independent is an important concept. When I mentioned before that sometimes there's a lot of interconnectedness. So we want to be able to create small slivers of functionality that are independent in nature. Now, these pieces of functionality might be very small and you might need 5 or 6 pieces all put together to create something that ultimately you could launch into production for someone to use, but each sliver can live on its own. We also want stories to be negotiable. Going back to that card concept, you want to have enough detail so the team knows how to move forward, but you don't want it to be so prescriptive that there's no room for innovation, creativity, or negotiation. Because when push comes to shove, the team might need to make certain decisions. And the idea is that they want to still achieve the outcome for the customer, but they need to have some flexibility in how they might want to go about doing that. A user story should be small. It should fit within the confines of a sprint. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that if you have a 2-week sprint, your one user story should take up the whole 2 weeks. Ideally, we want to create this nice flow. So we would want our user stories to be able to be wrapped up in a day or 2, maybe 3. And when you have smaller chunks of work, it's going to make it that much easier to estimate. Because when you have a large scope of work, the estimates become wildly varied. And so when you know exactly what it is that you're working on, it's much easier to estimate. And then lastly, you want your user stories to be testable, because going back to that acceptance criteria, if you have work that you're doing and it's not something that you feel like you can actually test in any way, again, good indication that maybe what you have isn't a story after all. Maybe it's actually just a task. So when we talk about vertical slicing, we're talking about taking a very thin sliver, all the way through the layers of the architecture, UI, middleware, and database layer. And that's very difficult. It's easy in concept to understand, but it's very difficult in practice. Why is that? Well, we've got folks on teams who have areas of specialty and expertise. So if I'm a UI person on a team, I want to think about the UI. I want to get my pieces done. So I tend to want to have a user story, again in air quotes, that represents the work that I'm trying to do. And then somebody else on the team is that middleware person, and they're thinking about their work that they need to do. And then someone else is the database person, and they're thinking about their work. So typically what happens is these user stories are representative of the horizontal tasks that everybody on the team is doing. But it isn't until you put all of that together, kind of flip it on its side, that you say, well, this is the value. Your UI piece, your middleware piece, your data piece, all together, that's the value, not the individual slices. So we're asking folks to kind of flip things on its side and think about it in a much more vertical way, not a horizontal way. This is difficult also because it means that multiple people on a team are typically going to have to collaborate to get a user story to done. And instead, folks tend to want to just be able to go off and do their own thing and cross it off their list, not have to have that coordination back and forth. So that becomes difficult for folks as well. But that's what we mean by a vertical slice. So as an example of that, a couple years ago, I was working for a company and I had a product owner reporting to me named Jenny. Jenny had worked in another area of the company and had helped to build out a pretty complex dashboard that the organization used, and it was very successful. And so there was another initiative happening within the company. They were building out some other sort of dashboard with a bunch of data. They were moving from some platform to Hadoop, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And this team had been working for about 1.5 years, and there was seemingly no progress. Not that the team wasn't working, but they didn't have anything to show for their efforts. And the executives were starting to get frustrated and nervous. And so Jenny was brought in to help this team and serve as their product owner. Again, she was reporting to me. So almost immediately, I started getting phone calls. She is incompetent. She does not know what she is doing. She needs to be removed from this team. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? Like, Jenny's awesome. I don't understand. So I started to sit in on a bunch of their Scrum events, and it was like, okay, I know what's happening here. What was happening was that they didn't really have a product owner prior to Jenny. What they had was a tech lead who was acting as a product owner, but the tech lead was thinking horizontally, thinking technically, and not actually thinking in terms of what does the customer actually need. So we had to, again, work with this team to try to get them thinking in terms of the customer value that was being delivered. And that's what Jenny could do. She shouldn't have been expected to be a technical expert on all of these things. She's representing the needs of the business. So we worked with them for quite a bit, and we were able to start to think in terms of the data on the dashboard and all of the different components of the dashboard, the various reports that needed to be generated. And we started to focus things more in that customer-centric way, and the team was a lot more successful. But it was definitely a painful process. It wasn't like an overnight thing. So how do we take work that we have and turn it into something that is vertically sliced that can keep the focus on that customer? There are several patterns that you can apply to slice user stories, decompose that work. And these patterns that we're going to talk about, I'm going to go through each one of them, but these patterns that we talk about, you're probably in some way, shape, or form inadvertently doing this or unknowingly doing this. But by really understanding the patterns and intentionally applying the patterns, you're going to have a lot more success with being able to break things down. Because then when you are looking at something and you don't know how to break it down, you can run through these different patterns and say, is there one that I could apply here that might help me? So let's take a look at these. The first one is slicing by workflow steps. I'm going to use like Amazon type retail examples just because it's very easy for folks to relate to. So if I'm buying something on Amazon, I'm going to add to my cart, add my billing address, shipping address, payment, review my order, and I'm done. You can break down that workflow into individual user stories or multiple user stories. Even more powerful is, how do I quickly get from point A to point B in the shortest amount of time? Now, I'm sure that everybody on this call has used Amazon in the past. And as you know, when you're going through the checkout process, there are a bazillion ways from Sunday that you could purchase things and pay for things and ship things and all kinds of different options. And then you've probably also been on a site, I mean, I know I have, where you go in and it's a more rudimentary site, and you select your thing and you click this, you put your payment in and you click submit, and boom, it went. You're like, whoa, I didn't even get a review screen. Like, what happened there? Like, it's just very, very quick. So that is an example, though, of where they took the shortest path through the workflow to get to the end result. And then you can always layer on from there. Another pattern that you can apply is simple, complex. Essentially, the simple comes first, and then you build the complexity in later. So of course, Amazon provides me the ability to ship to multiple locations, but I'm not going to try to build it out to the nth degree until I know that building out that single shipping location is going to work. And then once I have proven that and gotten learnings from that and feedback on that from my customers, then I can layer in doing it in multiple locations. Slicing by business rule variations. You have states that collect sales tax, states that don't collect sales tax. There are going to be different variations in that functionality. You're going to be testing that functionality differently. So you might want to go ahead and split out that behavior based on those different business rules. And then you have slicing by major effort. So this is an example where you might have chunks of functionality that are very similar or have commonalities, or building out one might then bring you to building out the other, but you still want to make sure that you're splitting out that work. So for example, adding items to a shopping cart and adding items to a wish list are probably very similar in nature, and one's going to build off of the other, but they are different enough that you don't want to, kind of mesh all of that together. You want to separate that out. Then there's slicing by operations. So create, read, update, delete, CRUD functions that some of you might be familiar with the term CRUD. So for example, I want to create my profile on Amazon. I want to be able to update my profile. I want to be able to view what I added to my profile. I want to remove my profile altogether. All of these different CRUD operations could be broken out as separate user stories. There's slicing by variations in data. So we have, Amazon has customers that have Prime memberships and customers that do not. Depending upon whether or not they are a Prime customer, they're going to have different shipping dates and shipping costs and all of those sorts of things involved. So depending upon the data that you need to present to those different customers, you're going to have a different experience. You're going to have, again, have different testing that goes into play. So you can break out user stories based on variations in data that your customers might experience. And then there's slicing by interfaces, platforms, and roles. Mobile versus a tablet versus a computer. iOS versus Android. Am I a buyer on Amazon or a seller on Amazon? I'm going to have different experiences based on that. Going all the way back to that card conversation that we talked about, and not saying just a user, right? You would say as a buyer, as a seller. You're going to, again, have different experiences, and that's going to allow you to break your work down a little bit smaller. Then there is slicing by system qualities. And by no means am I suggesting that you should cut corners on these things. These are things like browser compatibility and system performance and, you know, ADA compliance, all those types of things. But if you are just trying to get some functionality out the door in front of your customers so you can get some feedback to even know how should we proceed, that is not the time where we need to be weighing down our user stories with all of this additional capabilities. We can go ahead and keep it very lean, build some things out, prove out what it is that we want, get that feedback from our customers, and then we can start to lay on these layer over these system qualities. There's a pattern of happy or unhappy path, use cases and scenarios. It's kind of like a multiple thing. So let's say I'm paying with a credit card on Amazon and my card is expired or declined. Well, that's an unhappy path. So I could start off by saying, we are going to build out this functionality to pay with a credit card. And from a testing perspective, we are going to assume that it always works. We will layer in the unhappy paths of expiration or declined card in a later user story. Different scenarios. You know, on Amazon, I can pay partially with a gift card and partially with a credit card. We'll layer that in later. That's an additional use case or it's an extension of the current payment capability. So think about those types of scenarios as well, and they can become different user stories. And then lastly, you can slice by spikes. Now, I'm always hesitant to talk about spikes because I feel like they're dangerous. In my experience, teams don't necessarily use spikes in the right way. A spike is something that you would employ when you're really not ready to actually build out the functionality fully yet because you don't feel like you have all of the answers. You don't feel like you know which path to take. And so you need a little bit more information. Typically, if you are going to do a spike, you have an intended outcome. We're going to just build out this little proof of concept to learn this thing to help us make the decision so that we can then build out the thing for real. Or we are going to build out this little bit of functionality or do this bit of research or what have you to get a few questions answered that's going to then propel us forward. The thing is, it should be the exception and not the rule, because what I see is teams saying, okay, well, we have this new functionality we need to build and we don't know enough about it. So in this sprint, we're going to do a spike and we're going to just research and design stuff. And then in the next sprint, we'll build it. And then in the next sprint, we'll test it. And well, congratulations, you've just created a mini waterfall approach. You're not even being agile in that case. So the analogy that I have heard from my colleague, Jason, is that it's like buying a vowel in Wheel of Fortune. So for those of you familiar with the game show, you know, when you spin the wheel and it lands on the dollar amount and you select a consonant to solve that puzzle, you're adding to your jackpot. But sometimes you just can't solve the puzzle until you know what some of those vowels are, and they cost money. So it's a trade-off decision. So you don't want to use a spike all the time. You only want to use them when you absolutely need to. So again, the exception and not the rule, but sometimes a spike does make sense. There's some clues that you can also use for story slicing, compound sentences. I want the system to do this and this and this. Your UI, when you have wireframes and things, they're a great guide to help figure out functionality and how to break it down. Error handling, talking about that unhappy path again. Definitely want to break out your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves. Those nice-to-haves should probably come later in the process. And keep an eye out for that technical voice, because it's probably not going to be a user story. With these patterns, just like fractions in high school, you can break something down with a pattern and then break it down some more and then break it down some more. So it's kind of like Russian nesting dolls. So here's an example of that workflow step I talked about, where I'm going to buy something on Amazon. So I'm entering all my billing, shipping, payment, all that. But then now we only have so much time in our sprint. So we're only going to focus on building out the billing address functionality. Well, the billing address, I can also apply the variations in data pattern and have a shipping address that's the same as my billing address or one that's different. So for right now, we're going to just assume that whatever address the customer puts in, that's where it's getting shipped. Again, you may not launch this to production, right? But you can still get that functionality built and then layer it on, because this is all about incremental development. So now I'm only going to work on the billing address that's the same as the shipping address. Well, there's different business rules depending on if you're shipping domestically or internationally. So let's only focus on domestic. And then let's keep it very simple, because even though we ultimately want to layer in some address validation, we're not going to worry about that right now. So that's how you start to skinny things down to get it in a way that will fit into your sprint. I want to get into a few more examples here. So I used to travel a lot before COVID, used Google Flights all the time, which was my inspiration for this example. And so I just threw out on these sticky notes some of the things that Google Flights allows you to do. I can view flight information for all major airlines. I can book departure and returning flights on different airlines. I can book one-way, two-way, multi-city flights, and so forth. So I just started to brainstorm, like, here's the functionality that Google Flights allows me to do. And if I took one of those examples, I want to book departure and returning flights on different airlines. There is a lot layered into that word book. Just think about that for a minute. If I'm booking a flight, I'm doing a bunch of things. I'm selecting a departure flight, a return flight, entering my passenger info, my seat assignments, and all of those things before I can submit my booking. So what we have here is a workflow. So I've just taken, with one word, I've just taken a user story and broken it down into 7 potential other user stories. But I can keep going, just like in my Russian nesting dolls example. So when I'm selecting my return flight, it says do it on different airlines. Well, I kind of need to make sure that I can do it on the same airline first. Sounds like a simple, complex pattern to me. And then I could keep on going. Enter passenger information. Well, I have that TSA PreCheck thing, so I'm a known traveler. And you need different information about me as a known traveler. So variations in data, depending upon the customer that is flying. So that's a way that you can layer these different patterns in to continually break things down. And that might be enough. I could probably go on and continue to decompose this set of stories further, but maybe that's enough for me, because what I have right now will fit into my sprint. And then if you look at these other clues, we're not going to go into each one of these, but think about one-way, two-way, multi-city. Sounds like simple, complex to me. All major airlines. Sounds like you might be able to do one at a time, right? Different interfaces to different airlines, for example. So be using those words as clues. Now, I know that there's probably at least maybe one person on this call that has either been to one of my other talks or has maybe seen a YouTube video or whatever and said, Kim, I've already seen that example. Okay, so I want to keep going. Lately, I have been on this kick of using MyFitnessPal. I use it every day to log all of my meals, my exercise, and my water consumption. So if you're not familiar with MyFitnessPal, this is just a quick little view into the interface. As you can see here, it breaks it out by breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I can add food for all those different times of day, even snacks, and then exercise and water. Well, when it looks like it's all kind of the same thing there from a UI perspective, but in reality, I would consider these to be three separate major efforts, because even though there's a lot of functionality that is similar, I'm going to be putting different data in for my exercise and my water consumption versus my food consumption. So I would break those out separately. And then let's zero in on just adding food. So MyFitnessPal offers a whole bunch of different ways for me to log my food into the application. So for one, I could create meals, right? I could say tuna melt. And so I take all the ingredients that I use for a tuna melt, and I can put that all in and then just add tuna melt at a given point. I might put in a recipe. So, 2 cups of flour, 4 cups of sugar, whatever, and then it'll add all that together and then figure out what is the carbs and the protein and everything. I can take a package and just scan the barcode and it'll fill the information in for me. I can manually add the food. And then when I've added food in the past, it keeps a history of what I've previously logged. And so I can just quickly add from my history. So if I take that, well, now look at all of these potential user stories that I have just created. So I have my major effort, food, exercise, water, but now I have this kind of simple, complex path through the system in terms of how to log food, because certainly manually entering something is going to be a lot simpler than building in the capability to scan a barcode. So it goes progressively more complex as you move on down the line. Adding a meal previously created or a recipe previously created, again, seems like a major effort to me, because I can't even add a meal or a recipe until that capability in the system has been built out in the first place. And then I can keep going, because I had those three, but in the history, I can filter by most recent eaten or most frequently eaten. Well, that's variations in data. And then I could keep on going. What if I'm scanning a barcode on a package and it doesn't read? That sounds like an unhappy path to me. So again, the idea is that you can continue to break these things down using these patterns. One other point I wanted to make was I do get a lot of feedback, and I have a challenge for the folks on the call, because one of the things I do get a lot is, well, that's great. When you're using these, very straightforward, examples, software development examples, it's one thing, but what about when I have this complex infrastructure or what have you? So I am interested in understanding, do you have a unique situation or scenario where you have tried to break things down and you didn't really know how to do it, and it may not fit a typical UI, middleware, database type layer scenario? So one example that I did come across recently with a team that or a company that I was working with, was there were 2 separate teams, and they were building out functionality where a customer could use a mobile interface or a mobile app and determine whether purchases that they made would apply to their HSA account, their health savings account. The team one was doing all of this back-end work, creating these APIs to all these different product lookup databases. They were the ones responsible for building out the barcode scanning capability on the back end and so forth. Then you had team 2, and they were the mobile interface team. And they were the ones that are like, well, we need to be able to have customers enter in this barcode information on the mobile app, but we are completely stuck. We can't do anything because we are waiting on team one to do all of that infrastructure work first before we can do anything. So again, I didn't have an opportunity to dig into the nitty gritty with this team, but with just having some high level conversations with the product owner, we did come to the realization that, you know what, team one, they're building out a lot of APIs and you need that to be able to hook in, but they're probably linking to a bunch of different data sources, different product categories, maybe different retailers and so forth. And so in that case, different data sources, variations in interfaces, and the types of products and the retailers and all might be variations in data, for example. Maybe there's one, set of products that it's all over-the-counter medications versus, say, ACE bandages, for example. So when we started talking about it a little bit more and just digging in, I started asking the product owner for the mobile team, and they said, well, first we're going to manually enter barcodes just using the numbers, and then eventually we're going to build in to scan it all in. But right now we can't do anything. Our hands are tied. So again, simple, complex pattern for the mobile team. And what we talked about was, you know what? I don't think that everything that team one is doing is all underlying infrastructure. What team one could do is say, we are going to plug into just this one data source, very limited set of data, and we are going to coordinate with team two. They're going to build out just the manual entry of that barcode, and let's see if we can get that to work. Manually enter a barcode, and it's only going to hit this one data source. Maybe that's not enough to get the whole thing out into production just yet, but it is going to be enough to make sure that that experience is working the way it should, that the data is coming back correctly, and so forth. And then they could be layering on those additional interfaces, sprint over sprint. And at a certain point, they may have enough that, well, maybe the barcode scanning's not there yet, but if they could get all of it in place for the manual entry, well, heck, that would be of value to the customer for production use. Let's go ahead and build that out. So the conclusion that we came to was that the real underlying infrastructure dependency was less about the APIs to all of the different data sources and things. It was really that barcode scanning. So that was the one architectural enabler that team two was definitely dependent upon. But they could have kind of merged those efforts together and created small slivers and incremental value along the way. Now, in an ideal world, I would have loved for that all to have been on one team. That's a conversation for another day. But the fact that they had these two teams, I think that they could have aligned a little bit more closely. So that's just another example. And I would love to hear more of those types of examples that you might be running into, because I may take a few of those and try to do some sample breakdowns, maybe write a blog about it or something along those lines. So those were the ones that I wanted to share with you today. I do have some links, and you'll receive this presentation, so you'll have some links in there that you can reference as well. I did not create vertical story slicing. I just happen to be very passionate about it and think it's very important for teams. So lots of different information on this topic. And other than that, I'm ready to take whatever questions you have and use our remaining time to just have some conversation.
So Kim, that was great. I loved what you've done with adding some different examples in there and how you're kind of helping break down the different ways of applying multiple patterns to one story. So I really appreciated that. There was a couple examples in there that I hadn't even seen yet. So that was great. We have a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, let everybody know we are going to find ways to answer all of them. It may not be in this particular webinar, but they're all really great. And so like Kim said, some of them might turn out to be blog posts. Some of them might turn out to be future webinars. Some of them might turn out to just be a written out answer in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out to everybody with the link to the recording. So there's a category of questions that are really around inspiring people to try this when they haven't done it yet before. And so in some case, it might be because the folks who are doing it are pretty technical, right? Architects turned technical managers. they've got a lot of experience writing software by the layers, like you were talking about, and trying to get them to think about vertical story slicing. It's brand new, right? They haven't done it. Or just generally, like, how do we inspire a team to try it? Who's the right person? What role could be the one that's the catalyst to get a team to try it? So in your experience as a consultant, what are some of the things that you've done to kind of help inspire some practice in this area for a team that hasn't yet done it yet?
Absolutely. So a couple thoughts on this. So number one, I often give this talk, and I do believe that ideally, the product owner would be the first in the line to employ these patterns and these practices, but they can't do it in a vacuum, because inevitably what happens is the product owner comes into product backlog refinement, and the team members are like, well, I don't like how that's broken down, and I'm not going to do that. Can you create a story for this? And, because again, they want to think in terms of their world and what they need to do. So unless the rest of the team also has an understanding of these concepts, it makes it very difficult. So one of the things I recommend is show your team members this video when you ultimately receive it, because, or, send them some of the other links or whatever that we have, because just getting them to even be thinking about it is very important. Obviously, from a Scrum Master perspective, Scrum Masters are a great role to help the team in this way as well, because frankly, just because someone is a product owner doesn't even mean that they're necessarily thinking in this way all the time. The other thing that I would recommend is, instead of trying to do it for new work that is coming down the pike, go back to past work that you've done and look at some of that and say, wow, that was a story that took us too long. We couldn't get it all done. Or maybe it was a story that was fine, but just something that would be representative, and try to apply the patterns to those. Because frankly, it's easier in hindsight to do it than when you're trying to do it fresh. And by maybe going backwards and decomposing them in that way, it'll get the team thinking about it for future work. So those will be some ideas.
Yeah, one of the other things that comes to mind, Kim, is also understanding kind of the why change might actually benefit both the team and the consumer, the value, right? Anytime you're going to choose to do something different, you're going to go over some kind of learning curve and hurdle, right? And it's true whether you're doing, the MyFitnessPal type stuff, right? Where the vision of why you're even bothering to do it must be compelling enough to learn the app and use it. Mm-hmm. Right. So part of what I'm wondering is, how do you communicate why learning a new way of doing this might actually be, in the long run, much more beneficial, both for the team and for the customer or whoever is going to consume the value of that? How do you articulate that?
I think a lot of it is about reducing risk overall, because when we talk about Scrum and we talk about the events and we talk about transparency and inspection and adaptation, the whole reason those events are set up is so that we can minimize our risk by getting early feedback and not having to go back and do things. But if your work isn't broken down in the right way in the first place, and you go into a sprint review and you're showing a lot of back end stuff and the customer doesn't even really understand it anyway, then it still means that you're potentially going to go multiple sprints before you have something that the customer really understands. And at that point, they're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not what I wanted. So if you are starting from the get-go early on and creating these slivers of value that the customers truly understand, you're going to get that earlier feedback. And then you're not going to find yourself 4 sprints in saying, we have to redo all of this other stuff because we technically didn't really show them the value earlier.
Right. Yeah. I think that's, also tied in with one of the other questions that somebody asked, which is, if the ultimate goal, and we go back to your Amazon example, if the ultimate goal is for somebody to purchase something, vertical story slicing doesn't necessarily mean that you're stopping that piece of value from being delivered. I think what you were showing is it gets reduced to, there's only one path to make a purchase rather than 10 paths to make a purchase, but you're still trying to show a slice that does go all the way down to completing the one of the objectives that the shopper might have. Right. And that's the piece about reducing risk. If you can make that happen and happen successfully, right? You've proven out lots of things in
Yeah.
order to demonstrate that.
And I do think one of the things that folks get a little fuzzy about is at the end of a sprint, the idea is that we would have, a potentially usable set of work. And that you can get the feedback on that. But there is a difference between having it be, potentially usable and able to be put into a production environment. It might be hidden behind a feature flag because you might need three things put together before you can actually turn on that feature flag and have a customer actually use it. And that's okay. So we want to separate out this kind of continuous integration to production from when is the market or the customer ready to consume that functionality.
Yeah, so we only have a couple minutes left, but that is almost answering the other one I was going to pose to you. Was a bit shorter question, which what is the difference between a story and a feature?
Okay, so I mean, in reality, a feature is a larger, it's a larger set of functionality that is going to give the customer, a broader set of value. Typically, a feature is going to, there's different ways that people define features. If you are, talking in terms of scaled agile, for example, they will say that a feature is something that fits within a program increment or a PI. And so you want to get that done in that planning increment. And the user stories are the things that comprise that. So ideally, you're going to have a bunch of small slivers of functionality in the form of user stories that form and help to create that feature. And that feature is what the customer will ultimately you'll go to market with.
Okay. All right. So I mean, if I were to summarize some of the things that I've learned in there, one of the ways that you could help your team think about vertical story slicing is to kind of pose that challenge around applying multiple patterns in order. So for the team that says, oh, I can't get any smaller than that. I love the way you kind of demonstrated looking for those keywords and then taking that word and then looking at the list of potential patterns and say, is it really true that that word is a single thing, or could we start to, break it up in another way? So a couple of the questions that came in was really about, well, how do you make progress if the team is just adamant that, nope, it's as big as it can't get any smaller, right? So it's kind of do what you did in this webinar would be one way of doing it, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more of an art form. It takes a lot of practice. It's not always going to be perfect. Also, the other thing I'll just add is that sometimes, the pattern, don't worry, don't get hung up on the pattern itself. Someone might say, well, that's variations in business rules. And someone else might say, well, I thought it was variations in data. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. Just, it's the idea that you're attempting to apply a pattern to break something down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's good advice.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we're at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for joining and listening. Kim, thank you so much for talking about this again. And I really appreciate all the questions. So like I said, these are really valuable, I know, to us and to everyone who was here on the call. And so we are going to make great use of them and continue to kind of build on this particular topic and create more opportunities for us to have these kinds of conversations to kind of help figure out how do we do this, right? And how do we leverage the power of good story writing and story slicing for the benefit of both the team and for the ultimate customer who gets the value at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everybody again. And I do hope that I can take a look at more of these questions. And I would love for you to send along some of your examples and let's keep the conversation flowing.
All right. Well, thank you, Kim. Thanks, everybody. Until the next time we talk, have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.